In the ruins of Berlin, 1945, Soviet soldiers discovered a burned corpse outside a concrete bunker 30 feet beneath the earth. The charred remains belonged to the man who had plunged the world into its deadliest conflict, orchestrated the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, and brought about the complete destruction of his own nation. But this man had not always been a monster. He had once been a child with dreams, a struggling artist, a decorated soldier. The transformation from failed painter to history's most notorious dictator remains one of the most disturbing stories ever told. How does an unremarkable Austrian become the architect of genocide? How does a homeless vagrant rise to command millions? How does a single individual harness the power to reshape the world through hatred and war? The answer lies not in destiny or inevitability, but in a perfect storm of personal trauma, historical circumstance, and the darkest impulses of human nature. For decades after his death, historians have pieced together the fragments of his life through diaries, documents, testimonies of those who knew him, and the propaganda he left behind. What emerges is not the story of a man born evil, but something far more unsettling. The story of how ordinary failures and resentments, combined with extraordinary circumstances, can produce extraordinary evil. This is the complete history of Adolf Hitler, from his birth in a small Austrian town to his death in a Berlin bunker, from struggling artist to mass murderer, from nobody to the man who nearly destroyed civilization itself. Every detail matters, because understanding how this happened once might be the only way to prevent it from happening again. On April 20th, 1889, in a modest inn along the Austrian-German border, a child was born who would one day hold the fate of millions in his hands. The town was Braunau am Inn, a place so unremarkable that its only distinction was its position between two nations that would later unite under this child's rule. His mother Clara, exhausted from a difficult labour, cradled her fourth child, while his father, Alois, a stern customs official, 23 years her senior, registered the birth with typical bureaucratic precision. They named him Adolf. The Hitler household was a study in contrasts that would shape the future dictator's personality. Alois Hitler was a man who had clawed his way up from illegitimate birth to middle-class respectability. Born Alois Schickel-Gruber, he had only taken the Hitler name at age 39 when his father finally acknowledged him. This history of illegitimacy haunted Alois, making him obsessed with authority, status, and control. He ruled his household with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience from his children and wife. Clara Hitler could not have been more different. 23 years younger than her husband, she was actually his third wife, and had previously been his household servant. Where Alois was harsh, she was gentle. Where he was distant, she was devoted. She had already lost 3 children before Adolf was born, making her fiercely protective of her surviving son. This created a household where young Adolf experienced both brutal authoritarianism and suffocating affection, a duality that would manifest in his adult personality as both ruthless cruelty and desperate need for loyalty. The family moved frequently due to Alois's work, never allowing Adolf to form lasting friendships or connections. By the time he was 15, they had relocated 3 times. Each move deepened his sense of isolation and his retreat into fantasy. At school, Adolf was neither exceptional nor terrible, but distinctly mediocre. His teachers remembered him as moody and resentful of authority, traits that intensified after he entered secondary school in Lintz. The Lintz years marked a critical transformation. Adolf had expected to excel academically, but found himself struggling among more talented students from better backgrounds. Rather than work harder, he withdrew into grandiose fantasies. He would spend hours sketching architectural plans for rebuilding Lintz, imagining himself as a great artist who would one day transform cities. When his grades suffered, he blamed his teachers for failing to recognize his genius. It was also in Lintz that Adolf first encountered German nationalism in its most virulent form. His history teacher, Leopold Putsch, was a pan-German nationalist who filled his lectures with tales of German superiority and the corruption of the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire. For a boy seeking both identity and someone to blame for his failures, these ideas were intoxicating. Adolf began wearing the blue cornflower, symbol of German unity, and greeting classmates with Heil rather than the Austrian service. The conflict with his father escalated during these years. Alois wanted Adolf to follow in his footsteps and become a civil servant, a respectable career that offered security and status. Adolf claimed he wanted to be an artist, though this was less a genuine ambition than a way to rebel against his father's authority. Their arguments grew increasingly violent, with Alois beating his son and Adolf retreating further into sullen defiance. Then on January 3rd, 1903, Alois Hitler collapsed and died of a lung hemorrhage at the local tavern. He was 65 years old. Adolf, just 13, showed no emotion at the funeral. Years later, he would claim he had cried, but contemporaries remembered him as cold and unmoved. With his father dead, the main source of discipline in his life vanished. His mother, always indulgent, now had no check on her permissiveness. Adolf convinced Clara to let him leave school at 16, promising he would educate himself privately to enter art school. In reality, he spent the next 2 years in complete idleness. He would sleep until noon, spend his afternoons walking through Lintz or sketching grandiose architectural plans, and his evenings at the opera. He had one friend, August Kubizek, the son of an upholsterer who shared his love of Wagner's operas. To Kubizek, Adolf would deliver hours-long monologues about art, architecture, and the degradation of German culture, practicing the oratorical style that would later mesmerize millions. During this period, Adolf developed an obsession that revealed his capacity for fantasy and self-delusion. He became infatuated with a young woman named Stephanie Isak, whom he would watch from afar as she walked along the Landstrasse. For months, he composed love poems and imagined their future together, yet he never once spoke to her. When Kubizek suggested he introduce himself, Adolf flew into a rage, insisting that spiritual communion was superior to mere conversation. This pattern of preferring fantasy to reality, of choosing grandiose delusion over modest achievement, would define his entire life. In May 1906, Adolf travelled to Vienna for the first time, ostensibly to study the city's architecture, but really to escape the provincial limitations of Lintz. The imperial capital dazzled him with its grand boulevards, monumental buildings, and cultural sophistication. He spent 2 weeks visiting museums, attending the opera, and walking the Ringstrasse, the magnificent circular boulevard that showcased the Habsburg Empire's power. He returned to Lintz, more convinced than ever that he was destined for artistic greatness. But destiny had other plans. In January 1907, Clara Hitler was diagnosed with breast cancer. The Jewish doctor who treated her, Eduard Bloch, would later describe her as the most devoted mother he had ever seen, and Adolf's grief as the most profound he had witnessed. As Clara's condition worsened through the year, Adolf nursed her with unexpected tenderness, sleeping by her bedside and attending to her needs. It was the only time in his life he would show such sustained compassion for another human being. On December 21, 1907, Clara Hitler died at age 47. Adolf was 18 years old and now completely alone in the world. Dr. Bloch found him weeping beside his mother's body and would later write, "I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief." At the funeral, Adolf stood motionless by the grave, long after the other mourners had departed, staring into the earth that had swallowed the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally. With both parents dead and a small inheritance in hand, Adolf Hitler prepared to leave Lintz forever. He told anyone who would listen that he was going to Vienna to become a great artist. In reality, he was a provincial teenager with modest talent, no discipline, and an ego so fragile that it required constant protection through fantasy and blame. He was about to enter a city that would shatter his illusions and forge his hatreds into an ideology that would one day consume the world. Through fantasy and blame. In September 1907, Adolf Hitler arrived in Vienna carrying 2 suitcases and boundless ambitions. The 18-year-old from provincial Lintz believed he was beginning his journey to artistic greatness. He rented a small room on the Stumpergasse near the Westbahnhof station and immediately applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, the most prestigious art school in the Austrian Empire. For the entrance exam, candidates had to submit a portfolio and complete 2 3-hour drawing sessions on biblical and classical themes. When the results were posted in October, Adolf's name was not among the successful candidates. Out of 113 applicants, only 28 were accepted. The rejection letters stated his test drawings were unsatisfactory and showed unfitness for painting. The Academy suggested he might have more aptitude for architecture, but that would require returning to school for his diploma, something his pride would never allow. This rejection was a crushing blow from which he never psychologically recovered. For the rest of his life, he would nurse this grievance, convinced that the Academy had failed to recognize his genius. Rather than return to Lintz in defeat, Adolf remained in Vienna, maintaining the fiction in his letters that he was a successful art student. His friend, August Kubizek, joined him in February 1908, sharing a small room on the Stumpergasse. To Kubizek's bewilderment, Adolf maintained an elaborate pretense of attending classes, while actually spending his days wandering the city, visiting museums, and attending the opera when he could afford tickets. At night, he would subject Kubizek to lengthy monologues about rebuilding Vienna, creating grand opera houses, and reforming human society. But Kubizek noticed disturbing changes in his friend. Adolf's mood swung wildly between megalomaniacal fantasy and bitter despair. He would rage against the Academy, against modern art, against the mixing of races he observed in Vienna's streets. He began developing bizarre theories about breeding humans like horses to create a master race. When Kubizek gently suggested he might get a job, Adolf exploded in fury, declaring that manual labour was beneath a future genius. By summer 1908, Kubizek left Vienna for military service, and Adolf was truly alone. In September, he attempted the Academy entrance exam again, but this time his portfolio was rejected without even allowing him to take the drawing test. This second rejection shattered his last pretense of normal ambition. He moved out of his lodgings without leaving a forwarding address, cutting all ties with his past. For the next year, he effectively disappeared. What followed was a descent into genuine poverty. His inheritance dwindled as he refused to seek employment, considering any regular work beneath him. By autumn 1909, he was homeless, sleeping on park benches and in doorways, shuffling through Vienna's streets in a torn overcoat given to him by a Jewish old clothes dealer. He later called this period the harshest school of his life, though he conveniently omitted that his suffering was entirely self-imposed. In December 1909, nearly frozen and starving, Adolf sought refuge in a homeless shelter in the Meidling district. The Asyl für Obdachlos was a modern facility that provided a bed, bath and bread to the destitute. There he met Reinhold Hannisch, a vagabond who would briefly become his business partner. Hannisch convinced Adolf that he could earn money painting postcards of Vienna's landmarks for tourists. It was the ultimate humiliation for someone who had imagined himself the next Rembrandt, but necessity finally overcame pride. In February 1910, Adolf moved to the Mannheim, a men's hostel on the Meldemannstrasse that was a step up from the homeless shelter. The hostel, ironically funded largely by Jewish philanthropists, became his home for the next 3 years. He established a routine of painting postcards in the morning and spending afternoons in cafes reading newspapers and political pamphlets. The reading material available in cheap Viennese cafes was overwhelmingly nationalist, anti-Semitic and pan-German, feeding his search for someone to blame for his failures. Vienna before World War I was a cauldron of ethnic tensions and radical ideologies. The city's population had exploded from 400,000 to over 2 million in 50 years, drawing Czechs, Poles, Hungarians and Jews from across the empire. German speakers like Hitler felt threatened by this diversity, seeing their cultural dominance eroding. Mayor Karl Lueger had built his political career on anti-Semitic rhetoric, though he was pragmatic enough to work with wealthy Jews when convenient. Georg von Schönerer preached a more radical pan-German nationalism, calling for union with Germany and the exclusion of Jews from public life. Adolf absorbed these ideas but gave them his own paranoid twist. Where Lueger was a practical politician and Schönerer an aristocratic ideologue, Hitler was a failed artist seeking a cosmic explanation for his personal inadequacies. He began to see Jews not just as economic competitors or cultural outsiders, but as a biological poison deliberately undermining the German race. This was not the casual prejudice common to his era, but something more systematic and obsessive. His reading during this period was vast but completely undisciplined. He devoured cheap pamphlets on race theory, mystical interpretations of Wagner's operas, and pseudo-scientific tracts about the superiority of the Aryan race. He read not to learn, but to confirm his prejudices, selecting facts that supported his worldview and dismissing everything else as Jewish propaganda. This intellectual dishonesty would later characterize Nazi ideology, which dressed primitive hatred in the language of science and philosophy. Life in the Mannheim revealed Adolf's peculiar personality to its full extent. He would sit in the common room, painting his postcards, while lecturing anyone who would listen about politics, art and architecture. Residents remembered him as a strange figure who flew into rages over trivial disagreements, but could also be oddly charming when discussing his favourite subjects. He formed no close friendships, trusted no one, and seemed to exist in a world of his own imagination. One resident, Josef Greiner, later described Adolf's daily routine in detail. He would wake late, spend an hour meticulously grooming his small moustache, paint for a few hours, then hold court in the reading room. His paintings were technically competent, but utterly devoid of human warmth. He could reproduce buildings with mechanical precision, but never attempted to capture human figures or emotions. When someone suggested he paint people to make his postcards more marketable, he replied that he painted architecture because humans disgusted him. The paradoxes of his Vienna years would puzzle historians for decades. He lived in a hostel funded by Jewish charity while developing his anti-Semitic ideology. He was saved from starvation by a Jewish doctor's free treatment of his mother and helped by Jewish art dealers who sold his paintings, yet he was already formulating theories about Jewish racial corruption. He claimed to champion the German worker while refusing to work himself, living off his orphan's pension and painted postcards. By 1913, Adolf Hitler had spent 6 years in Vienna accomplishing nothing but the cultivation of his resentments. He was 24 years old, with no career, no friends, no romantic experiences, and no future. He had failed as an artist, failed to get an education, failed even to register for military service as required by law. Yet in his own mind, he was not a failure, but an unrecognized genius, a prophet who understood the racial struggle that others were too blind to see. In May 1913, he suddenly left Vienna, telling no one of his plans. He had received the final portion of his father's estate, giving him enough money to relocate. But the real reason for his departure was a letter from the Lintz authorities demanding he report for military service in the Austrian army. The man who would later send millions to their deaths in war was fleeing to avoid his own military duty. He crossed the border into Germany, heading for Munich, the city he had always considered more truly German than cosmopolitan Vienna. Behind him, he left nothing but a few acquaintances who remembered him as an eccentric failure. No one could have imagined that this peculiar vagrant, this painter of mediocre postcards, this coffeehouse philosopher with his half-baked theories about race, would return to Vienna 25 years later as its conqueror. But first he would have to survive a war that would transform him from nobody into somebody, from a failed artist into a decorated soldier, from a man running from service into a man who found his only meaning in uniform. Adolf Hitler arrived in Munich on May 25, 1913, carrying forged papers that claimed he was stateless. The Bavarian capital represented everything he believed Vienna should have been, but wasn't. Here was a truly German city, untainted by the ethnic mixing he despised, where art and culture flourished in purely Germanic forms. He rented a small room above a tailor's shop on the Schleißheimer Strasse and resumed his routine of painting postcards, but now with renewed energy. Munich's architecture, from its Gothic churches to its neoclassical monuments, provided endless subjects for his mechanical reproductions. For 20 months, Adolf lived a life of contented obscurity in Munich. He spent his days in cafes reading newspapers, his evenings in beer halls listening to political debates, and maintained himself through the sale of his paintings to local frame shops and art dealers. His landlord, Joseph Popp, would later describe him as a quiet, polite tenant who paid his rent on time and kept to himself. No one suspected that this unremarkable lodger was a draft dodger wanted by the Austrian authorities. But in January 1914, his past caught up with him. The Austrian consulate, having tracked him to Munich, had him arrested and extradited to Salzburg for failing to register for military service. Facing potential imprisonment, Adolf wrote a pathetic letter to the authorities, pleading poverty and ignorance, claiming he had tried to register but been unable to afford the journey. His grovelling worked, after a medical examination, declared him unfit for combatant and auxiliary duty, too weak, incapable of bearing arms. He was released to return to Munich. 6 months later, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. As Europe's alliance system triggered a chain reaction toward war, Adolf Hitler stood in the Odeonsplatz on August 2nd among thousands of Munich residents celebrating Germany's declaration of war on Russia. A photograph from that day shows him in the crowd, his face lit with an ecstasy that seems almost religious. While others saw tragedy approaching, he saw salvation. The war would give him what peacetime never could: purpose, belonging, and a uniform to hide his failures. On August 16, 1914, Adolf Hitler enlisted in the Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, known as the List Regiment after its commander. The man who had been declared unfit for Austrian service was accepted without question by the Bavarians, who needed every able body for the massive mobilization. Within weeks, the failed artist who had never held a steady job, never had a romantic relationship, never succeeded at anything, found himself in the one institution where he would finally excel: the army. The List Regiment was thrown into combat with minimal training at the First Battle of Ypres in October 1914. This engagement, later called the Kindermord bei Ypern, the massacre of the innocents at Ypres, saw untrained German reserve units hurled against experienced British regulars. Of the 3,600 men in Hitler's regiment who entered the battle, only 611 remained fit for service 4 days later. Adolf himself narrowly escaped death when a shell exploded in the command post, killing nearly everyone except him. But where others saw horror, Hitler discovered his calling. He volunteered for the dangerous job of regimental messenger, running messages between command posts and frontline trenches through artillery barrages and machine gun fire. This role suited his solitary nature perfectly. While other soldiers formed friendships in the trenches, he remained alone, running through no man's land with dispatches. His comrades found him peculiar, a man who never received mail from home, never talked about women, never complained about the war. His dedication bordered on the fanatical. He refused leave, claiming he had nowhere to go. He lectured fellow soldiers who expressed war weariness, accusing them of defeatism. He adopted a stray dog named Foxel, lavishing on the animal the affection he could never show to humans. When other soldiers grumbled about conditions, he proclaimed that the trenches were his university, the war his true education. For someone who had failed at everything in civilian life, military service provided structure, purpose, and the first recognition he had ever received. The recognition was substantial. In December 1914, he received the Iron Cross Second Class, unusual for someone of his low rank. In 1916, he was wounded in the left thigh by a shell fragment during the Battle of the Somme, spending 2 months recovering in a hospital near Berlin. His first visit to the German capital depressed him. He saw defeatism, war profiteering, and what he called Jewish shirkers avoiding military service. He begged to return to his regiment, preferring the honest danger of the trenches to the corruption he perceived in the rear. Back at the front in March 1917, he participated in the Battle of Arras and the Third Battle of Ypres, somehow surviving battles that killed millions. His comrades nicknamed him the White Crow for his strange behaviour and seemingly charmed life. In 1918, he received the Iron Cross First Class, an exceptional honour for a mere corporal. The recommendation came from Hugo Gutmann, a Jewish lieutenant, a fact Hitler would later go to great lengths to conceal. By autumn 1918, even Hitler could see that Germany was losing the war. The spring offensive had failed, Americans were arriving in overwhelming numbers, and German allies were collapsing. On the night of October 13, 1918, south of Ypres, his luck finally ran out. British forces launched a gas attack, and Adolf was caught in a cloud of mustard gas that seared his eyes and throat. Temporarily blinded, he was evacuated to a hospital in Pasewalk, northeast of Berlin. It was there, lying in a hospital bed with his eyes bandaged, that Adolf Hitler experienced what he would later describe as the defining moment of his life. On November 10th, a pastor arrived to inform the patients that Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated, the war was lost, and Germany was now a republic. Hitler claimed he experienced a second blindness, this one psychosomatic, as the shock of defeat overwhelmed him. He wept for the first time since his mother's death, not for the millions dead, but for the defeat of the German Empire. In his hospital bed, the 30-year-old corporal underwent what he would later mystically describe as a vision. He claimed to have heard voices commanding him to restore Germany's greatness. More likely, his fragile psyche, unable to accept that his one source of success and meaning had ended in defeat, simply snapped. The war had given him everything civilian life had denied: purpose, recognition, belonging. Now it was over, and he faced a return to the nobody he had been before 1914. But Adolf Hitler, who emerged from that hospital, was not the same man who had entered the war. 4 years in the trenches had transformed the lazy Viennese vagrant into someone hardened by violence and decorated for bravery. The war had taught him that human life was cheap, that violence solved problems, that loyalty to the cause mattered more than individual conscience. Most importantly, it had shown him that ordinary people, given uniforms and orders, would commit extraordinary acts of both heroism and brutality. He would later call the war years the greatest and most unforgettable time of his earthly existence. While millions of survivors wanted only to forget the horror, Hitler wanted to recreate it. The comradeship of the trenches became his model for society, the chain of command his ideal government, the enemy his explanation for all problems. He would spend the rest of his life trying to return Germany and himself to those days of clarity, when there were only two sides, only two choices: victory or defeat, life or death, German or enemy. As he prepared to leave the hospital in November 1918, Adolf Hitler made what he claimed was a sacred vow: to reverse the defeat and punish those responsible. The failed artist had found his new calling. He would become a politician, not from any democratic impulse, but from a burning desire for revenge. The war was over, but for Hitler it had only begun. He would continue fighting it by other means for the next 27 years, until it finally consumed him and millions of others in a conflagration that would dwarf even the great war he could never accept had ended. Adolf Hitler returned to Munich in November 1918 to find a city in chaos. Revolution had erupted across Germany as sailors, soldiers, and workers formed councils inspired by the Russian Bolsheviks. In Bavaria, a Jewish journalist named Kurt Eisner had proclaimed a socialist republic, overthrowing the ancient Wittelsbach monarchy. For Hitler, watching Jewish intellectuals lead the revolution that had stabbed the German army in the back confirmed every paranoid theory he had developed in Vienna. The enemy was no longer theoretical, but visible, tangible, and in power. With no civilian skills and nowhere else to go, Hitler remained in the army, stationed at the Türkenkaserne barracks in Munich. While Bavaria descended into political chaos, he kept his head down, avoiding taking sides publicly while inwardly seething. When Eisner was assassinated in February 1919, the situation spiraled further out of control. A Soviet republic was declared in April, led by Jewish revolutionaries like Eugène Leviné and Max Levien. For 3 weeks, red flags flew over Munich, while bourgeois hostages were executed and property was confiscated. The German government in Berlin dispatched the Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary units, composed of war veterans, to crush the Soviet Republic. They entered Munich in May 1919 with devastating force, killing over 600 people, many of them civilians with no connection to the revolution. Hitler watched these events carefully, learning how a small group of determined men with guns could overthrow a government and how violence, properly applied, could achieve political goals. After order was restored, the army needed to ensure the loyalty of troops who had witnessed revolution. They established education courses to inoculate soldiers against Bolshevism, and Hitler discovered his gift for political speaking. His superiors, impressed by his passionate denunciations of Marxism and the November criminals who had signed the armistice, assigned him as an education officer. For the first time in his life, he had a captive audience for his monologues about racial struggle and Germany's betrayal. Captain Karl Mayer, head of the army's information department, recognized Hitler's potential as a speaker and informant. In June 1919, he sent Hitler to a special course at Munich University on politics, history, and economics. There, Hitler encountered professors and students who gave academic legitimacy to his crude prejudices. He learned to dress his gutter anti-Semitism in the language of racial science and his personal resentments in terms of historical destiny. On September 12, 1919, Mayer ordered Hitler to investigate a small political group called the German Workers' Party, which met in the back room of the Sterneckerbräu beer hall. Hitler attended expecting to find another irrelevant fringe group to report on. The party, founded by a locksmith named Anton Drexler and a sports journalist named Karl Haarer, had barely 50 members and no real program beyond vague nationalism and anti-Semitism. During the meeting, when a professor argued that Bavaria should separate from Germany and unite with Austria, Hitler could not contain himself. He launched into a passionate rebuttal that left the room stunned. His spontaneous speech so impressed Drexler that he pressed a pamphlet into Hitler's hand and begged him to return. Hitler initially had no intention of joining this pathetic group, but as he read Drexler's pamphlet, My Political Awakening, he saw an opportunity. The German Workers' Party was so small and disorganized that an energetic individual could quickly dominate it. Hitler joined as member number 555, though the party started its numbering at 500 to appear larger. He immediately took charge of propaganda, discovering that his real genius lay not in painting pictures, but in painting word pictures that could move crowds. His speeches, beginning in October 1919, transformed the party's sleepy meetings into packed, passionate gatherings. Hitler's speaking style was unlike anything Munich had seen. He would begin quietly, almost hesitantly, feeling out his audience. Then, as he sensed their emotions, he would build to a crescendo of rage, his voice rising to a scream, his body contorting with passion, sweat pouring down his face. He spoke not to their reason, but to their resentments, telling them they were victims of a vast conspiracy of Jews, Marxists, and November criminals. The war had not been lost on the battlefield, but through betrayal. Germany's suffering was not their fault, but the result of racial pollution. By February 1920, Hitler had effectively taken over the party, now renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. He designed its program of 25 points, a contradictory mix of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and vague socialist promises designed to appeal to everyone dissatisfied with the status quo. More importantly, he created the party's visual identity, the swastika flag in red, white, and black, colours that evoke the imperial flag, while the ancient symbol promised a return to mythical Aryan greatness. The party grew rapidly, feeding on the chaos and resentment of post-war Bavaria. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, had imposed crushing reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions on Germany. Hyperinflation destroyed middle-class savings, while French occupation of the Rhineland humiliated German pride. Hitler offered simple explanations and even simpler solutions. Eliminate the Jews, tear up the treaty, restore German greatness through racial purity and will. To provide muscle for his movement, Hitler formed the Sturmabteilung, the SA or stormtroopers, in 1921. These brown-shirted thugs, drawn from unemployed veterans and young toughs, specialized in breaking up rival meetings and protecting Nazi gatherings. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, was a scarred war veteran and homosexual who saw violence not as a means to power, but as an end in itself. The SA gave Hitler's words physical force, terrorizing opponents and creating an atmosphere of crisis that made his extreme solutions seem necessary. By 1923, the Nazi Party had 55,000 members, and Hitler had become a significant figure in Bavarian politics. He formed alliances with other right-wing groups and secured funding from wealthy industrialists who saw him as a useful tool against communism. He cultivated relationships with prominent figures like General Erich Ludendorff, the war hero whose prestige could legitimize a grab for power. The opportunity seemed to arrive in autumn 1923. French troops had occupied the Ruhr industrial region to enforce reparation payments, triggering passive resistance and economic collapse. Hyperinflation reached insane levels, with a loaf of bread costing billions of marks. The Berlin government seemed paralyzed, while Bavaria's conservative leaders openly defied federal authority. Hitler convinced himself that if he could seize power in Munich, he could march on Berlin just as Mussolini had marched on Rome the previous year. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler struck. Bavaria's leaders were holding a meeting in the Bürgerbräukeller, Munich's largest beer hall, when Hitler and his SA burst in. Firing a pistol into the ceiling, Hitler declared the national revolution had begun. He forced the Bavarian leaders at gunpoint to agree to support his putsch, though they renounced it as soon as they escaped. The next morning, Hitler and about 2,000 followers, including Ludendorff, marched toward the center of Munich. At the Feldherrenhalle, they encountered a police barricade. Shots rang out, though no one knows who fired first. Within seconds, 16 Nazis and 4 police officers lay dead or dying. Hitler, marching arm in arm in the front row, was pulled to the ground so violently that his shoulder was dislocated. While Ludendorff marched straight through the police lines, Hitler fled in a car, abandoning his dead and wounded followers. The beer hall putsch had failed in less than 24 hours. 2 days later, Hitler was arrested at a friend's villa, cowering in an attic, threatening suicide. The man who would later send millions to their deaths for showing cowardice had fled at the first gunfire. His movement seemed finished, his followers scattered, his reputation as a leader shattered. The newspapers mocked him as a cowardly Austrian corporal who had led decent Germans to their deaths. It seemed like the end of Adolf Hitler's political career. But Hitler would transform his trial for treason into a propaganda triumph, his imprisonment into a sabbatical for writing, his failure into a learning experience. The beer hall putsch taught him that power could not be seized through force alone in a modern state, with a monopoly on violence. He would have to take the legal path to power, using democracy to destroy democracy, using the system to destroy the system. The failed revolutionary would become a patient politician, waiting for his moment, building his movement, until the very republic that imprisoned him would hand him the keys to power. The trial of Adolf Hitler for high treason began on February 24, 1924, in a converted infantry school in Munich. What should have been the end of his political career became instead his greatest propaganda victory yet. The sympathetic judges who shared his nationalism, if not his methods, allowed him to turn the courtroom into a platform for his ideas. For 24 days he held forth on Germany's betrayal, the Jewish conspiracy, and his sacred mission to restore national greatness. Hitler's closing statement lasted 4 hours. He proclaimed himself not a traitor, but a patriot, not a criminal, but a prophet. "You may pronounce us guilty 1,000 times over," he declared, "but the goddess of the eternal court of history will smile and tear to pieces the state prosecutor's submissions and the court's verdict, for she will acquit us." The conservative judges, moved by his passion and sharing his hatred of the Weimar Republic, gave him the minimum sentence, 5 years in prison with the possibility of early parole. Landsberg prison, where Hitler served his sentence, was less a jail than a comfortable retreat. He had a large cell with a view of the countryside, could receive visitors daily, and was allowed to organize his fellow Nazi prisoners. Guards addressed him as Herr Hitler and celebrated his 35th birthday with him. Rather than breaking rocks or performing hard labor, he spent his days dictating his political testament to his devoted secretary, Rudolf Hess, who had voluntarily joined him in prison. The result was Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a tedious, repetitive, and barely readable book that would become the Bible of the Nazi movement. Part autobiography, part political manifesto, part racial pseudoscience, the book laid out Hitler's worldview with terrifying clarity. History was racial struggle. The Aryan race was the creator of all culture. The Jew was a parasite destroying civilization from within. Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, which would be seized from the inferior Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. Democracy was a sham, war was noble, and the strong had the right to dominate the weak. More significant than its turgid content was what Mein Kampf revealed about Hitler's strategic thinking. He had learned from his failed putsch that power must be seized legally, that the masses must be mobilized through propaganda, that allies were necessary among conservatives and industrialists. The book also showed his growing megalomania. He presented himself not as a politician with a program, but as a messiah with a mission, chosen by Providence to save Germany. While Hitler dictated his book, the Nazi Party nearly disintegrated. Without his leadership, it split into feuding factions. The party was officially banned, its assets seized, its leaders scattered. Some wanted to merge with other nationalist groups, others to focus on electoral politics, still others to continue revolutionary violence. By the time Hitler was released on December 20th, 1924, having served only 9 months, his movement was in ruins. But Hitler had used his imprisonment wisely. He had written his book, consolidated his leadership, and planned his comeback. On February 27, 1925, he relaunched the Nazi Party at the Bürgerbräukeller, the site of his failed putsch. 4,000 supporters packed the hall to hear him speak for 2 hours, ending factional disputes through sheer force of personality. He proclaimed there would be only one leader, one program, one path to power. The party would be his instrument, following his will absolutely. The new Nazi Party was different from its predecessor. Hitler created a nationwide organization with a clear hierarchy leading directly to himself. He established the Hitler Youth to indoctrinate the young, the League of German Girls for Females, professional organizations for doctors, lawyers, and teachers. The SS, initially just his bodyguard, would grow into an elite force personally loyal to him alone. Every aspect of German life would have its Nazi organization, creating a state within a state. But growth was painfully slow in the stable years of 1925 to 1929. The Weimar Republic, guided by Gustav Stresemann's pragmatic foreign policy and American loans, experienced relative prosperity. Unemployment fell, wages rose, and Germany was readmitted to the international community. In this atmosphere, Hitler's apocalyptic rhetoric seemed out of place. The 1928 elections were a disaster for the Nazis, winning only 2.6% of the vote and 12 seats in the Reichstag. Hitler used these lean years to refine his message and methods. He recognized that different groups required different appeals. To workers, he promised employment and dignity. To the middle class, he offered protection from communism and restoration of savings destroyed by inflation. To industrialists, he guaranteed the destruction of trade unions and Marxism. To the military, he promised rearmament and revenge for Versailles. To everyone, he offered someone to blame for their problems, the Jews. He also developed his revolutionary understanding of propaganda, learned partly from studying American advertising techniques. Politics was not about educating people, but manipulating their emotions. Messages must be simple, repeated endlessly, and appeal to feelings rather than reason. The bigger the lie, the more likely people would believe it, because they could not imagine someone lying so audaciously. Propaganda must create an emotional reality more powerful than actual reality. The party's visual presentation became increasingly sophisticated. Nazi rallies were theatrical spectacles with dramatic lighting, stirring music, and choreographed movements of uniformed masses. The swastika appeared everywhere, a brilliant branding exercise that made the party instantly recognizable. Hitler himself crafted his image carefully, practicing gestures in front of mirrors, having his photograph taken from different angles to find his best side, creating an aura of mystery by remaining unmarried and avoiding normal social situations. Most importantly, Hitler built a leadership cult around himself. He was not just the party's leader, but its prophet. Not just a politician, but Germany's savior. His word was law, his will the party's only program. This Führerprinzip, leadership principle, meant that all authority flowed from Hitler personally. There was no party ideology independent of Hitler's thoughts, no party structure independent of Hitler's will. This would later enable him to commit his crimes, as millions would follow orders simply because they came from the Führer. By 1929, the Nazi Party had 130,000 members, and an organization reaching into every corner of Germany. It had its own newspapers, its own paramilitary forces, its own symbols and rituals. It was a revolutionary movement disguised as a political party, a cult of personality masquerading as a democratic option. All it needed was a crisis to make Germany desperate enough to embrace its radical solutions. That crisis was about to arrive. In October 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashed, triggering a global depression that would hit Germany particularly hard. American loans that had kept the German economy afloat were called in, banks failed, factories closed, unemployment soared. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, 1/3 of the workforce. Middle-class families saw their savings evaporate again. Workers stood in breadlines, farmers faced foreclosure. The Weimar Republic's democratic parties seemed helpless in the face of economic catastrophe. They bickered and formed unstable coalitions while Germans suffered. Into this chaos stepped Adolf Hitler, no longer seeming like a ridiculous extremist, but a strong leader offering simple solutions. The failed putschist had learned his lessons well. He would not seize power through violence, but be handed it by those who thought they could use and control him. They would discover, too late, that they had unleashed forces beyond their comprehension. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 struck Germany like a hammer blow. American banks recalled their loans, German businesses collapsed in chain reactions of bankruptcy, and unemployment exploded from 1.4 million to 3 million within a year. By September 1930, when new elections were called, the democratic center of German politics had collapsed. Desperate people do not vote for moderate solutions, and Adolf Hitler was ready with his promise of radical transformation. The 1930 election campaign showed the Nazi Party's evolution into a formidable political machine. Hitler barnstormed across Germany, sometimes speaking at 3 or 4 rallies a day. He was among the first politicians to use airplanes extensively, allowing him to appear almost simultaneously in multiple cities, creating an aura of omnipresence. His speeches were masterpieces of emotional manipulation, beginning with Germany's humiliation, building through promises of revenge, and climaxing with visions of national rebirth. But Hitler understood that passion alone would not bring power. Behind the theatrical rallies lay sophisticated organization and targeted messaging. Joseph Goebbels, the limping intellectual Hitler appointed as propaganda chief, pioneered modern campaign techniques. The Nazis produced different posters for different regions, emphasizing anti-Semitism in areas with Jewish populations, land reform in rural areas districts, anti-Marxism in middle-class neighborhoods. They were not selling a coherent program, but marketing resentment itself. The results stunned Germany and the world. The Nazis won 107 seats in the Reichstag, making them the second largest party. They had gone from the margins to the mainstream in a single election. Stormtroopers marched through the streets, singing their victory, while democratic politicians struggled to understand what had happened. Hitler, who had been dismissed as a crank just 2 years earlier, was suddenly one of the most powerful men in Germany. Yet power remained frustratingly out of reach. President Hindenburg, the elderly war hero who embodied traditional Prussian conservatism, despised Hitler as an upstart Austrian corporal. The Democratic parties still commanded a majority if they could unite, which their mutual hatreds made impossible. The communists were growing too, offering their own radical solution to the crisis. Germany entered a period of governmental paralysis, with chancellors ruling by presidential decree as the Reichstag proved incapable of forming stable majorities. Hitler pursued a dual strategy during this period. Publicly, he emphasized legality, presenting himself as a democratic politician ready to work within the system. When radical SA leaders demanded immediate revolution, he slapped them down, insisting that power must be won through ballots, not bullets. In a masterful moment of political theatre, he appeared as a witness in a trial of army officers accused of Nazi sympathies, and swore that the party would only seek power through legal means, though once in power, heads would roll. Privately, however, Hitler was building a shadow state ready to seize control. The SA grew to 400,000 men by 1932, larger than the official German army limited by Versailles. These brown-shirted thugs controlled entire neighborhoods, beating political opponents, smashing Jewish shops, and creating an atmosphere of barely controlled violence. The message was clear: only the Nazis could restore order, because only the Nazis were creating the disorder. The 1932 presidential election showed both Hitler's growing strength and his remaining limitations. He challenged Hindenburg directly, forcing the octogenarian president into a runoff. Hitler won 37% of the vote, transforming himself from party leader to national figure. His campaign used every modern technique: films, phonograph records, mass-produced literature, and a carefully crafted image that presented him as Germany's messiah. Posters showed him in soft focus, with the simple slogan "Hitler," as if his name alone was a political program. But Hindenburg still won, and Hitler's path to power seemed blocked. The July 1932 Reichstag elections saw the Nazis become the largest party with 230 seats, but they still lacked a majority. Hitler demanded to be appointed Chancellor, but Hindenburg refused, reportedly saying he would not hand power to that Bohemian corporal. The Nazi vote actually declined in November 1932, suggesting their momentum might have peaked. Party finances were strained, the SA was growing restless, and some Nazi leaders began to despair. It was at this moment of apparent weakness that Hitler's patience and cunning paid off. Conservative politicians, led by Franz von Papen, hatched a fatal plan. They would make Hitler Chancellor, but surround him with conservative ministers who would control him. They believed they could use his popular support while containing his radical agenda. Papen, a vain aristocrat who had been a disastrous chancellor himself, convinced himself and others that Hitler could be tamed, domesticated into a traditional politician. The industrialists who had long feared Nazi socialism now saw Hitler as their protection against communist revolution. The army, initially suspicious of the former corporal, began to see the Nazis as useful allies in their dream of rearmament. Even Hindenburg's advisors, watching the elderly president decline and fearing chaos, began to consider Hitler as the least bad option. They all made the same fatal miscalculation. They thought they were smarter than Adolf Hitler. On January 30th, 1933, After weeks of backroom negotiations, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler arrived at the presidential palace in a morning coat, playing the respectable statesman. That evening, thousands of SA and SS men marched through the Brandenburg Gate in a torchlight parade that lasted hours, their flames reflecting off Hitler's face as he stood at a window, watching his moment of triumph. The conservative politicians who had engineered this appointment congratulated themselves on their cleverness. Hitler was Chancellor, but he had only 2 other Nazis in his cabinet. Vice-Chancellor Papen boasted, "We've hired him. In 2 months we'll have pushed him into a corner so hard he'll be squeaking." They did not understand they had not hired Hitler. They had unleashed him. They had not contained the Nazi revolution. They had legitimized it. Within days, Hitler showed his true intentions. He demanded new elections, promising they would be the last. He appointed Hermann Göring as Prussian Interior Minister, giving the Nazis control of Germany's largest police force. He began placing party loyalists in key positions throughout the bureaucracy. Most importantly, he retained his pose of legality even as he systematically destroyed the legal foundations of the state. The transformation of Germany from democracy to dictatorship would take less than 6 months. The conservatives who thought they could control Hitler would be swept aside, imprisoned, or forced to collaborate. The institutions they thought would contain him, from the presidency to the army to the churches, would either submit or be destroyed. The Austrian corporal they had mocked would become the most powerful dictator in German history. On that January evening in 1933, as the torches marched through Berlin, few understood what had truly happened. Germany had not just acquired a new chancellor, it had embarked on a path that would lead to the destruction of European civilization. The failed artist who had once slept in homeless shelters now held the fate of millions in his hands. The Great War veteran who could not accept defeat would plunge the world into an even greater conflict. The nobody had become somebody, and the world would pay the price for that transformation in blood. Adolf Hitler had barely settled into the Reich Chancellery when he set his plan in motion. On February 27, 1933, less than a month after taking office, the Reichstag building erupted in flames. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was caught at the scene. But whether he acted alone or was manipulated by the Nazis remains debated. What matters is how Hitler exploited the fire. Within hours, he convinced the senile Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree for the protection of the people and state that suspended civil liberties, allowing arrest without trial, censorship of the press, and suppression of political opposition. That night, thousands of communists, social democrats, and trade unionists were arrested. SA men, now deputized as auxiliary police, settled old scores while claiming to protect Germany from Marxist revolution. The March 5th elections, held in an atmosphere of terror, still did not give Hitler the majority he wanted. Even with massive intimidation, the Nazis won only 44% of the vote. But it no longer mattered. Democracy was already dying, and Hitler had the tools to bury it. The Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, was democracy's death certificate. This law gave Hitler the power to pass legislation without the Reichstag, essentially making him a legal dictator. To secure the 2/3 majority needed, Hitler banned communist deputies and surrounded the Opera House, where the Reichstag met with SA men chanting, "We want the bill or fire and murder." Only the Social Democrats voted against it, their leader Otto Wels courageously declaring that though they could take the socialists' lives, they could never take their honor. With legal power secured, Hitler moved against all potential opposition with breathtaking speed. Trade unions were dissolved on May 2nd, their leaders arrested, their assets seized. All political parties except the Nazis were banned by July. State governments were brought under Nazi control through the appointment of Reich governors. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents. Within 6 months, Germany's federal democracy had become a centralized dictatorship. But Hitler faced a threat from within his own movement. The SA, now swollen to over 3 million members, had become a state within a state. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, Hitler's old comrade from the Munich days, demanded a second revolution that would merge the SA with the army and implement the socialist aspects of National Socialism. The army generals whose support Hitler needed for his rearmament plans viewed Röhm with alarm. Conservatives who had helped Hitler to power feared the SA's radicalism. On the night of June 30th, 1934, Hitler struck. In what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, SS units murdered the entire SA leadership. Hitler personally arrested Röhm at a Bavarian resort, finding him in bed with a young man. Röhm was shot in his cell after refusing to commit suicide. Across Germany, old enemies were eliminated. They killed Gregor Strasser, who had challenged Hitler's leadership. They murdered Gustav von Kahr, who had betrayed the beer hall putsch. Even the conservative politicians who had opposed Hitler, including former Chancellor von Schleicher, were gunned down. At least 85 people died, possibly hundreds more. Hitler appeared before the Reichstag to justify the murders, claiming he had saved Germany from a treasonous plot. The army, relieved to see their SA rivals eliminated, pledged their loyalty. The conservatives, terrified by Hitler's willingness to murder even his oldest comrades, fell silent. Most Germans fed propaganda about Röhm's homosexual orgies and revolutionary plots, accepted or even applauded the killings. Hitler had shown he was capable of anything, and rather than provoking resistance, it inspired submission. When Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, becoming the Führer, the supreme leader. Every soldier and civil servant now swore a personal oath, not to Germany or its constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. This personalization of loyalty would have profound consequences. Breaking this oath would not be treason against a state, but betrayal of a sacred bond to an individual. The transformation of German society proceeded at every level. Joseph Goebbels, as propaganda minister, took control of all media, culture, and public expression. Newspapers that did not toe the Nazi line were shut down. Books that contradicted Nazi ideology were burned in public spectacles. Films, radio, music, and art were all enlisted in the service of the regime. Even private conversations became dangerous, as children were encouraged to inform on parents who expressed doubt about the Führer. The persecution of Jews escalated systematically. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and Aryans. Jews were progressively excluded from professions, education, and public life. On November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, saw synagogues burned, Jewish businesses destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men sent to concentration camps. The world watched and protested, but did nothing effective to stop it. Meanwhile, Hitler rebuilt Germany's military strength in violation of Versailles. Conscription was reintroduced in 1935. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, emerged from secret training programs. New tanks rolled off production lines, disguised as tractors. The Autobahn highway system, sold as civilian infrastructure, was designed to move armies rapidly. Unemployment vanished as millions found work in armaments factories or construction projects. Germans who asked no questions about where this led enjoyed economic recovery and restored national pride. Hitler's foreign policy mixed aggression with cunning timing. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, gambling correctly that France would not fight. That same year, he sent forces to support Franco's fascists in the Spanish Civil War, using Spain as a testing ground for new weapons and tactics. He formed the Axis alliance with Mussolini's Italy and later added Imperial Japan, creating a global coalition of aggressive powers. The Anschluss with Austria in March 1938 fulfilled Hitler's old dream of uniting all Germans. He returned to Vienna not as the failed artist who had fled in 1913, but as conquering hero, greeted by cheering crowds and tolling bells. The Cardinal Archbishop ordered churches to fly swastika flags. Hitler stood on the balcony of the Hofburg Palace, where Habsburg emperors had once ruled, and proclaimed the Greater German Reich. But Hitler wanted more than just German-speaking lands. At Munich in September 1938, Britain's Chamberlain and France's Daladier handed him the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia in exchange for his promise that this was his last territorial demand. Chamberlain returned to London waving the agreement and proclaiming, "Peace for our time." Hitler privately mocked him as a worm. Within 6 months, German troops occupied all of Czechoslovakia, proving that his promises meant nothing. By 1939, Hitler stood at the peak of his power. He had transformed Germany from a defeated nation into Europe's dominant force without firing a shot. He had built a totalitarian state, more complete than even Stalin's Soviet Union. He commanded the absolute loyalty of millions who saw him as Germany's savior. International leaders who had once dismissed him as a clown now feared him as the continent's master. But conquest and domination were not enough. Hitler's ideology demanded war, demanded Lebensraum in the East, demanded the elimination of the Jewish race. The man who had spent 4 years in the trenches of World War I had never truly left them. He had simply been preparing for a greater war, one that would determine the racial hierarchy of the world for 1,000 years. The failed artist had become the most powerful man in Europe, but power had not satisfied his hatreds or moderated his ambitions. It had only given him the means to pursue them on an unimaginable scale. On August 23, 1939, the world watched in disbelief as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other, signed a non-aggression pact. The secret protocol of this agreement, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, divided Eastern Europe between them, like gangsters splitting territory. Poland would be partitioned, the Baltic states would fall to Stalin, and Hitler would have a free hand in the West. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler could finally launch the war he had been planning since writing Mein Kampf. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, 1.5 million German troops poured across the Polish frontier. Hitler had manufactured a pretext, staging fake Polish attacks on German border posts, using condemned prisoners dressed in Polish uniforms. But pretexts hardly mattered anymore. This was a war of conquest, pure and simple. The Wehrmacht's new style of warfare, later called Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, shattered the Polish army in days. Tanks punched through defensive lines, aircraft destroyed communications, motorized infantry exploited breakthroughs. The Polish cavalry, charging German tanks with lances and sabres in a scene from another century, became a symbol of the collision between old and new ways of war. Warsaw held out heroically for 3 weeks. But when Soviet forces invaded from the east on September 17th, Poland's fate was sealed. Britain and France declared war on September 3rd, but could do nothing to save Poland. The phony war that followed saw Allied forces sitting behind the Maginot Line, while Germany digested its conquest. Hitler had gambled that the Western powers, having failed to fight for Czechoslovakia, would not really fight for Poland either. He was half right. They declared war, but did not wage it, missing their best opportunity to attack, while most German forces were in Poland. The conquest of Poland revealed the true nature of Nazi rule. Behind the advancing armies came the Einsatzgruppen, special SS units, tasked with eliminating Poland's intellectual and political leadership. Thousands of priests, teachers, doctors, and nobles were shot. Jews were herded into ghettos, the first step toward their eventual extermination. Hitler had ordered his generals to conduct the war with unprecedented brutality, telling them this was not a conventional conflict, but a racial struggle for existence. After securing Poland, Hitler turned west. On April 9, 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in 6 hours, the shortest campaign in military history. Norway, despite British naval superiority, was conquered in 2 months. The speed and audacity of German operations stunned the world. Hitler had seized ports and airfields from the Arctic Circle to the Danish border, securing Germany's iron ore supplies and naval bases for attacking Britain. But these were merely preliminaries to the main event. On May 10, 1940, Hitler launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The attack began with spectacular airborne assaults on key fortifications. German gliders landed on top of Belgium's supposedly impregnable Fort Eben-Emael, taking it in hours. Paratroopers seized bridges deep in enemy territory. The Dutch surrendered after the Luftwaffe leveled the center of Rotterdam, killing nearly 1,000 civilians. The main German thrust came through the Ardennes forest, considered impassable for armor by French generals, who were still thinking in World War I terms. Panzer divisions under Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel raced through the forest, crossed the Meuse River, and drove toward the English Channel, cutting off the Allied armies in Belgium. The speed of advance was so rapid that German generals grew nervous, fearing a trap, but Hitler urged them forward. By May 20th, German tanks reached the sea, trapping the British Expeditionary Force and French First Army. The Allies fell back on Dunkirk, where a miracle evacuation saved 338,000 troops, but left all their equipment behind. Hitler's mysterious decision to halt his tanks outside Dunkirk, possibly to let the Luftwaffe claim the victory or preserve his armour for the campaign ahead, allowed the evacuation to succeed. It would prove one of his first major military mistakes. France collapsed with shocking rapidity. The government fled Paris on June 10th. On June 14th, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. Hitler insisted on signing the armistice in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, dancing a little jig of joy that was captured on film. In 6 weeks, he had accomplished what the Kaiser's armies could not in 4 years. He was master of Western Europe. Hitler toured conquered Paris like a tourist, visiting the Eiffel Tower and Napoleon's tomb in the early morning of June 23rd. Standing at the tomb of the French emperor who had also conquered Europe before catastrophic defeat in Russia, Hitler should have seen a warning. Instead, he saw only confirmation of his destiny to succeed where Napoleon had failed. Unable to invade Britain, Hitler turned to terror bombing. The Blitz killed 40,000 British civilians, but strengthened rather than broke British resolve. Hitler's decision to switch from attacking RAF airfields to bombing cities, triggered by a small British raid on Berlin, saved the RAF and lost Germany the battle. For the first time, Hitler had failed to achieve his objective. The aura of invincibility cracked. While the Luftwaffe bled over Britain, Hitler was already planning his ultimate objective, the destruction of the Soviet Union. On December 18, 1940, he signed Directive 21 for Operation Barbarossa. The conquest of Russia would provide Lebensraum for German settlers, eliminate the Jewish Bolshevik threat, and secure the resources to fight a long war against the Anglo-American powers. It would be a war of extermination, with no rules, no mercy, no prisoners. Hitler spent the spring of 1941 securing his flanks for the Russian campaign. When Mussolini's invasion of Greece from Albania turned into a fiasco, German forces had to bail out their Italian allies. In a lightning campaign in April 1941, Wehrmacht forces conquered Yugoslavia in 11 days and Greece in 3 weeks. The swastika flew over the Acropolis. German paratroopers seized Crete in May, though at such cost that Hitler never used large-scale airborne operations again. By June 1941, Hitler commanded an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Balkans, from the Arctic to the Sahara. 3 million German soldiers, along with 600,000 allies from Romania, Hungary, Italy, and other nations, massed along the Soviet frontier. It was the largest invasion force in human history. Hitler told his generals this would be a different kind of war, a racial struggle where normal rules did not apply. The infamous Commissar Order mandated killing captured Soviet political officers. Einsatzgruppen units prepared to murder Jews en masse. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m., 3 million soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union along a 1,800-mile front. The invasion achieved complete surprise, despite numerous warnings Stalin had dismissed as British provocations. Soviet forces near the border were annihilated. In the first day alone, the Luftwaffe destroyed 1,800 Soviet aircraft, most on the ground. German panzers advanced up to 50 miles a day. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. By December, German forces had captured 3 million Soviet soldiers and reached the gates of Moscow. Hitler stood at the apex of his power. He had conquered more territory, more quickly than any commander in history. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he directed operations on multiple continents. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, the Afrika Korps fought in the desert, and the Wehrmacht drove toward the Caucasus oil fields. He seemed unstoppable, inevitable, the master of Europe's destiny. But Hitler had made fatal miscalculations. He had invaded Russia without defeating Britain, ensuring a two-front war. He had declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, adding the world's greatest industrial power to his enemies. He had turned a war of conquest into a war of extermination, ensuring desperate resistance. Most fatally, he had convinced himself that the Soviet Union would collapse after a few decisive battles, that Slavic racial inferiority guaranteed German victory. As the first snows began to fall in October 1941, and German soldiers discovered their summer uniforms offered no protection against the Russian winter, the limits of Hitler's power began to show. The man who had promised his soldiers they would be home by Christmas now faced the prospect of a long war against enemies whose resources dwarfed his own. The failed artist who had become Europe's conqueror was about to discover that conquest was easier than holding what he had taken. The German soldier, standing watch in the ruins of Stalingrad on Christmas Eve 1942, could barely remember the optimism of the previous summer. 6 months earlier, the Wehrmacht had launched Operation Blue, driving toward the Caucasus oil fields with unstoppable momentum. Now he stood in the skeleton of a city, surrounded by 2 million Soviet soldiers, eating horsemeat soup and burning furniture to avoid freezing to death. Stalingrad had become a grave for the German Sixth Army and the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad had begun as a strategic decision, but transformed into something pathological. The city bearing Stalin's name became a personal duel between the two dictators. Hitler diverted forces from the crucial Caucasus campaign to take the city, while Stalin declared it would be held at any cost. What followed was the bloodiest battle in human history, a 6-month nightmare that consumed over 2 million casualties. The initial German assault in August 1942 had nearly succeeded. The Luftwaffe reduced the city to rubble in massive bombing raids, killing 40,000 civilians in a week. German forces pushed Soviet defenders to a thin strip along the Volga River's western bank, but the ruins created perfect defensive terrain. Every building became a fortress, every room a battleground. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, fighting for individual floors, even individual rooms. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, repeatedly requested permission to withdraw when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus on November 19th, encircling 300,000 German troops. Hitler refused, declaring Stalingrad would be held to the last man. When Hermann Göring promised the Luftwaffe could supply the surrounded army by air, Hitler used this fantasy to justify his no-retreat order. The airlift delivered less than 1/3 of the minimum supplies needed. German soldiers began dying of starvation and frostbite by the thousands. Hitler's response to disaster was to promote Paulus to field marshal, knowing no German field marshal had ever surrendered. But on January 31st, 1943, Paulus did exactly that. The last German resistance in Stalingrad ceased on February 2nd. Of the 300,000 German soldiers trapped in the city, only 91,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity. Of these, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Hitler, watching from his headquarters, declared Paulus a traitor for not committing suicide and forbade any attempt to negotiate prisoner exchanges. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the first time, an entire German army had been destroyed. The psychological impact exceeded even the massive material losses. German allies began seeking ways out of the war. Neutral nations distanced themselves from the Reich. Most importantly, the initiative in the East passed permanently to the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a successful strategic offensive against Russia. While disaster unfolded at Stalingrad, the war had also turned against Germany in North Africa. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the desert fox who had driven the British back to Egypt, was decisively defeated at El Alamein in October 1942. When American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November, German forces were trapped between two advancing armies. Hitler's response was to pour reinforcements into Tunisia. Good divisions that died or surrendered when the African campaign ended in May 1943. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, ranked among his greatest strategic blunders. He was not obligated by treaty to join Japan's war, and America's isolationists might have kept the United States focused on the Pacific. Instead, Hitler handed Roosevelt the gift of turning American industrial might against Germany. By 1943, American bombers were joining the RAF in reducing German cities to rubble. The Holocaust, Hitler's war against the Jews, accelerated even as military fortunes declined. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 had coordinated the final solution, the systematic murder of European Jewry. Death camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor and elsewhere became factories of murder. Gas chambers could kill thousands daily. By 1943, trains carrying Jews to their deaths received priority over military supplies. Hitler's racial war had become as important as his military war. In July 1943, Hitler launched Operation Citadel, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. The attack on the Kursk salient employed new Tiger and Panther tanks, but Soviet intelligence had warned of the assault. The Soviets had prepared defences 40 miles deep and assembled reserves that outnumbered the attackers. The largest tank battle in history saw 6,000 tanks and 2 million men clash for 2 weeks. German forces gained minimal ground at enormous cost before Hitler cancelled the operation. After Kursk, the Soviet advance became relentless. They liberated city after city that German forces had conquered in 1941. Each retreat shortened German lines but brought the war closer to the Reich. Hitler's response was to declare every position a fortress that must be held to the last man. These orders resulted in the destruction of entire armies that might have survived to fight another day. Competent generals who recommended strategic withdrawals were dismissed and replaced with fanatical loyalists who obeyed suicidal orders. The war at sea had also turned. In May 1943, improved Allied convoy tactics, radar, and code breaking effectively won the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boat losses became unsustainable. The lifeline of supplies from America to Britain and Russia could no longer be severed. Meanwhile, Allied bombing of Germany intensified. Hamburg was incinerated in July 1943 by a firestorm that killed 40,000 people. Berlin, the Ruhr industrial region, and other cities were systematically destroyed. Hitler's response to military disaster was to retreat further into fantasy. He spent increasingly long periods at his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, or his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, avoiding bombed cities and wounded soldiers. His health deteriorated markedly. His left hand developed a tremor, possibly from Parkinson's disease. He relied on cocktails of medications prescribed by Dr. Theodor Morell, including methamphetamines that may have impaired his judgment. His leadership style became even more erratic. He micromanaged battles from hundreds of miles away, moving divisions on maps that no longer existed. He refused to visit the front or bombed cities, living in a bubble of propaganda and yes-men. When generals brought bad news, he flew into rages, accusing them of cowardice or treason. He clung to miracle weapons that would reverse the war: jet aircraft, V-2 rockets, even atomic weapons his scientists were nowhere near developing. By the end of 1943, Germany had lost the war strategically. The only question was how long it would take and how many would die before Hitler's regime collapsed. The Soviet Union was producing more tanks and aircraft than Germany, while suffering casualties it could replace, and Germany could not. American and British forces were preparing to invade Italy and France. German cities were being reduced to rubble. Yet Hitler refused any suggestion of negotiation, insisting on victory or destruction. The man who had promised Germans a 1,000-year Reich had led them into a war they could not win. The corporal who had never accepted Germany's defeat in 1918 was creating a defeat that would dwarf Versailles. But Hitler no longer cared about the German people's suffering. They had failed him by not being strong enough to achieve his vision. If they perished in the attempt, they deserved their fate. The failed artist's final masterpiece would be the destruction of the nation that had given him power. At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history began as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Hitler, sleeping at his Berchtesgaden retreat after taking a sedative, was not woken for several hours. When finally informed, he initially believed it was a diversion, that the real invasion would come at Calais. His delay in releasing panzer reserves to counterattack may have saved the Allied beachhead. By the time he fully grasped the situation, 150,000 Allied troops were ashore, and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. The successful invasion exposed the hollowness of Hitler's Atlantic wall defences and the Wehrmacht's inability to fight effectively on three fronts. While German forces struggled to contain the Normandy breakout, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration on June 22nd, the third anniversary of Barbarossa. This massive offensive destroyed an entire German army group, killing or capturing 400,000 soldiers and liberating all of Belarus. Warsaw fell, Romania switched sides, and Soviet forces reached the borders of the Reich itself. On July 20, 1944, Hitler narrowly escaped death when a bomb exploded during a conference at his Wolf's Lair headquarters. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had lost an eye and hand in North Africa, had placed a briefcase bomb under the conference table. Only a massive oak table support deflected the blast and saved Hitler's life. 4 officers died, but Hitler suffered only burst eardrums, singed hair, and torn trousers. The July plot represented the German resistance's last desperate attempt to eliminate Hitler and negotiate peace before total destruction. The conspiracy involved hundreds of officers, diplomats, and officials who recognized the war was lost, and Hitler was leading Germany to catastrophe. But the plot's failure triggered a savage purge. Over 5,000 people were executed, many hung from meat hooks with piano wire while being filmed for Hitler's viewing. The army, the last institution with potential independence, was thoroughly Nazified. Hitler interpreted his survival as Providence confirming his destiny. But physically and mentally, he was disintegrating. The tremor in his left hand worsened. He walked stooped, dragging his left leg. His eyes, once hypnotic, became dull and watery. He suffered from insomnia, stomach cramps, and headaches. Dr. Morell's medications, including cocaine eye drops and methamphetamine injections, created dependencies that may have accelerated his decline. By August 1944, Paris was liberated as German forces retreated across France. In the east, the destruction of Army Group Center opened the path to Berlin. Hitler's response was to conscript children and old men into the Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia armed with obsolete weapons. Boys of 14 and men of 60 were thrown against battle-hardened Allied armies. It was murder disguised as patriotism, but Hitler no longer distinguished between the survival of his regime and the survival of Germany. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944, Hitler's last gamble, showed how detached from reality he had become. He assembled Germany's last reserves for a surprise attack through the same forests that had brought victory in 1940, hoping to recapture Antwerp and split the Allied armies. Initially catching American forces off guard in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the offensive soon collapsed from lack of fuel and overwhelming Allied firepower. The reserves that might have delayed the Soviet advance on Berlin were wasted in a futile offensive. As 1945 began, the Reich was collapsing on all fronts. Soviet forces launched their final offensive on January 12th, crossing the Vistula River and racing toward Berlin. In the west, Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March after capturing an intact bridge at Remagen. German cities were rubble. Dresden was incinerated in February by a firestorm that killed 25,000 people. Industry had largely ceased. Transportation networks were destroyed. Yet Hitler refused any suggestion of surrender. In January 1945, Hitler descended into the Führerbunker, a concrete complex 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery garden. This subterranean world, with its narrow corridors, poor ventilation, and constant vibration from Allied bombing, became the surreal setting for the Third Reich's final act. Here Hitler held court over a phantom empire, moving non-existent armies on maps, issuing orders to destroyed units, planning counter-offensives with forces that existed only in his imagination. The bunker's atmosphere was one of impending doom mixed with delusional hope. Hitler would rage about betrayal and cowardice, then speak dreamily of miracle weapons or last-minute alliances that would save the Reich. He ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure to deny it to the Allies, his Nero decree stating that Germans had proven themselves weak and deserved to perish. Albert Speer, his architect and armaments minister, secretly countermanded these orders, saving what remained of Germany from complete destruction. As Soviet forces encircled Berlin in April 1945, Hitler oscillated between despair and fantasy. He spoke of fighting to the death in Berlin, then of escaping to continue resistance from an Alpine fortress. He blamed everyone but himself. The generals were traitors, the soldiers were cowards, the German people had failed their racial test. The man who had promised glory had brought only destruction, but he could never admit his fundamental responsibility. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery began shelling Berlin directly. The last gathering of Nazi leadership in the bunker had a funeral atmosphere. Göring, Himmler, and other hierarchs paid their respects and fled the city. Hitler emerged briefly into the Chancellery garden to decorate Hitler Youth boys. Children sent to die fighting Soviet tanks. The footage shows a trembling old man patting the cheeks of boys who would be dead within days. By April 22nd, Hitler finally accepted the war was lost. In a volcanic rage, he screamed about universal betrayal, then collapsed, declaring he would remain in Berlin and die. When informed that Heinrich Himmler had attempted to negotiate surrender through Sweden, Hitler ordered his arrest and execution. He felt betrayed by his most loyal subordinate, the architect of the Holocaust, though Himmler was simply recognizing what Hitler refused to see. The war was over. The Battle of Berlin was the Third Reich's death agony. Soviet forces fought street by street, house by house, against a hodgepodge of SS fanatics, Wehrmacht remnants, and terrified Volkssturm. Boys with anti-tank weapons faced T-34 tanks. The magnificent capital of Prussia was reduced to rubble. Civilians cowered in cellars as rape and pillage followed the Soviet advance. Hitler, safe in his bunker, showed no concern for their suffering. By April 28th, Soviet forces were less than a mile from the bunker. Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a bizarre ceremony in the bunker's map room. He dictated his political testament, learning nothing from catastrophe, blaming the Jews for the war he had started. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party and appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz, his successor. The failed artist was stage managing his own finale, determined to control his exit, as he could no longer control events. The final day of Adolf Hitler's life began like many others in the bunker. April 30th, 1945, saw Soviet forces only blocks away from the Reich Chancellery. The thunder of artillery had become constant, dust falling from the concrete ceiling with each impact. Hitler woke late, as was his custom, and received the last military briefing of his life. General Helmuth Weidling reported that ammunition would last perhaps another day, that Soviet forces would overrun the government quarter within 24 hours. Hitler showed no emotion. The decision had already been made. After lunch, Hitler and Eva Braun, married for barely 40 hours, withdrew to his private study. Hitler had tested the cyanide capsules on his beloved German Shepherd Blondie, watching her die to ensure the poison worked. He could not bear the thought of his body being displayed like Mussolini's, hung upside down in a public square for crowds to defile. At approximately 3:30 p.m, Hitler bit down on a cyanide capsule while simultaneously shooting himself in the right temple. Eva Braun took only poison. The man who had sent millions to their deaths chose the coward's escape when facing his own. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and Hitler's bodyguard found the bodies slumped on a sofa, blood pooling from Hitler's shattered skull. Following Hitler's instructions, they carried the corpses to the Chancellery garden. In a shell crater, they doused the bodies with gasoline and set them ablaze. As Soviet shells exploded nearby, the small group gave a final Nazi salute to the burning remains. The man who had promised Germans a 1,000-year Reich left behind only charred bones and a destroyed nation. The news of Hitler's death spread through the bunker and beyond, with varying reactions. Some wept, unable to imagine existence without their Führer. Others felt relief, as if a spell had been broken. Goebbels, the true believer to the end, poisoned his 6 children before he and his wife committed suicide the next day, declaring life without Hitler was not worth living. Others immediately began planning escape, suddenly free from their oath to a dead man. Admiral Dönitz, informed by radio that he was now head of state, initially attempted to continue the war. But the fiction could not be maintained. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. General Weidling, commanding the city's defense, ordered remaining forces to cease resistance. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, the same building Hitler had burned to seize power 12 years earlier. The symbolism was complete. Across the crumbling Reich, the end came at different speeds. Some fanatics fought on, others surrendered eagerly. In Prague, SS units continued massacring civilians even as Germany surrendered. In Norway, 400,000 German troops laid down their arms without firing a shot. The concentration camps were liberated, revealing horrors that exceeded the worst Allied propaganda. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, and dozens of other camps showed the world what Hitler's racial ideology meant in practice. Mountains of corpses, walking skeletons, and systematic murder on an industrial scale. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims. Stalin insisted on a second surrender in Berlin, which occurred on May 8th. The war in Europe was over. Hitler's war had lasted 5 years, 8 months, and 7 days. It had killed approximately 40 million Europeans, including 27 million Soviet citizens, 6 million Jews, and 5 million other victims of Nazi racial policies. Germany itself lost 7 million dead and was occupied, divided, and destroyed. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Millions of refugees fled westward, terrified of Soviet revenge. German prisoners of war disappeared into Soviet camps, many never to return. Cities were rubble, industry was destroyed, currency was worthless. The magnificent culture that had produced Beethoven and Goethe was reduced to women selling themselves for cigarettes and children scavenging in ruins. This was Hitler's gift to the master race he claimed to champion. The Nuremberg trials, convening on November 20th, 1945, attempted to bring justice to an unprecedented crime. In the same city where Hitler had held his triumphant party rallies, surviving Nazi leaders faced judgment. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's designated successor, defended the regime with cunning intelligence before cheating the hangman with a cyanide capsule. Others claimed they were just following orders, establishing a defense that would echo through subsequent war crimes trials. 12 were sentenced to death, others to imprisonment, but many escaped justice entirely. The full scope of the Holocaust emerged as investigators pieced together the bureaucracy of genocide. The Einsatzgruppen reports, the Wannsee Conference protocols, the meticulous records kept by the SS, all revealed how a modern state had organized mass murder. 6 million Jews had been systematically exterminated, along with millions of Roma, disabled individuals, homosexuals, political prisoners, and Slavic civilians. Hitler's vision of racial purity had produced history's most efficient killing machine. Germany itself was divided among the victorious Allies, split into occupation zones that would eventually become 2 separate states. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies began almost immediately, with Hitler's former capital divided by what would become the Berlin Wall. The nation Hitler had promised to make supreme was partitioned for 45 years, its eastern portion under communist rule, its western portion rebuilt as a democracy under Allied supervision. The psychological impact on Germans was profound. An entire generation had to confront its complicity or collaboration with evil. The concept of collective guilt emerged, debated and disputed. How could a civilized nation have followed Hitler? How could ordinary people have participated in or ignored genocide? The process of denazification attempted to purge German society, but proved impossible to implement fully. Too many had been involved. Society could not function if everyone guilty was punished. Hitler's impact extended far beyond Germany's borders. The war accelerated decolonization as European powers, exhausted and bankrupt, could no longer maintain their empires. The United Nations emerged from the war's ashes, attempting to create international structures to prevent future genocides. The State of Israel was established in 1948, partially as a response to the Holocaust, creating new conflicts that continue today. The nuclear age began with weapons developed to defeat Hitler's regime, forever changing the nature of warfare. The economic consequences reshaped the global order. The United States emerged as a superpower, its economy strengthened by war production, while Europe lay in ruins. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe, creating economic integration that would eventually become the European Union, itself a project designed to make another Hitler impossible by binding Germany and France together. The Bretton Woods system established a new economic order. The world Hitler had tried to conquer by force was transformed by his defeat. Studying Hitler poses uncomfortable questions about human nature and modern society. How did a marginal figure, a failed artist with no significant achievements, convince millions to follow him into barbarism? The answer lies not in Hitler's unique evil, but in his ability to exploit existing prejudices, economic anxieties, and national humiliations. He offered simple answers to complex problems, scapegoats for frustrations, and the intoxicating promise of national greatness. Hitler's techniques, refined by modern technology, remain terrifyingly relevant. The big lie, repeated endlessly until it becomes truth. The identification of enemies within to explain failures. The promise to restore a mythical golden age. The use of spectacle and symbol to bypass rational thought. The exploitation of democratic systems to destroy democracy. These tools did not die in the bunker with Hitler. They await the next demagogue who would use them. The Holocaust stands as history's warning about the destination of racial hatred. It began not with gas chambers, but with rhetoric, with laws, with the gradual dehumanization of the other. German doctors, lawyers, teachers, and ordinary citizens participated in or acquiesced to genocide, not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were human, susceptible to propaganda, peer pressure, and the abdication of moral responsibility to authority. Hitler's legacy is one of destruction so complete, it defies comprehension. Beyond the millions dead, the cities destroyed, and the cultures annihilated, he destroyed the very idea of progress, the Enlightenment belief that education and civilization inevitably lead to moral improvement. He showed that the most educated nation in Europe could embrace barbarism, that technology could serve genocide as easily as progress, that ordinary people could become willing executioners. Yet Hitler's legacy also includes the responses to his evil. The international human rights movement emerged from the Holocaust's ashes. The phrase "never again" became a rallying cry, even if honoured more in breach than observance. The documentation of Nazi crimes established precedents for confronting genocide. Germany's eventual reckoning with its past, however incomplete, provided models for other nations confronting historical crimes. The warning Hitler represents grows more relevant as the witnesses die and the events pass from memory to history. Each generation must learn anew that democracy is fragile, that hatred is seductive, that ordinary people can enable extraordinary evil. The Austrian corporal who became history's greatest monster was not an aberration, but a possibility latent in modern society, awaiting the right combination of crisis, prejudice, and moral failure. Hitler died believing himself a hero, betrayed by lesser mortals. History records him as proof of the depths to which humanity can sink when it abandons reason for rage, replaces ethics with ideology, and chooses hatred over humanity. His life stands as testimony that individuals matter, that a single person's pathologies can infect nations and destroy civilizations. But it also demonstrates that evil, however powerful, is ultimately self-defeating. The Third Reich that was to last 1,000 years lasted 12. The master race Hitler proclaimed was defeated by the diverse alliance of nations he despised. In the end, Adolf Hitler's biography is not the story of one man, but of the millions who empowered him, the systems that failed to stop him, and the catastrophe that results when hatred is given political form. He remains history's essential warning. This is what happens when we fail to defend democracy, when we remain silent against injustice, when we choose the comfort of prejudice over the difficulty of decency. The failed artist who became a genocidal dictator left only one valuable legacy: the knowledge of what we must never allow to happen again.